Okay, so welcome to our evening program. Thank you guys for braving the roads to join us today. I know it was kind of tough out there this evening. Tonight we're going to have 4 parts to our program, actually. I will briefly present on the More for the Mission program here at the Minnesota Historical Society. Then Anna Jurek will present on CEE, Center for Energy and Environment. And our main program will be by Nancy Lang, also from CEE, presenting on the Minnesota Energy Evolution timeline. And then we'll close up with a brief case study of an existing building commissioning project at the History Center, this building, by Chris Plum at the end there. So we'll be done by 7, and we'll have all the questions for any 4 of us at the end, starting at 7 o'clock. And after the program, we'll have some surveys out on the sign-in table, so I really encourage you to take a moment and fill out the survey. There's also a little QR code if you wanted to fill it out on your smartphone instead. So, to get us started, my name is Shenyan Zhu. I'm the Institutional Sustainability Specialist here at the Minnesota Historical Society, and I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the More for the Mission program here. More for the Mission essentially is a program that attempts to bring together sustainability goals with our institutional mission, and that mission is using the power of history to transform lives, preserving, sharing, and connecting. Essentially, our energy, waste, water, and resource conservation efforts save us money that can be used to achieve that mission. So we define sustainability as the capacity to endure. Essentially, this means the sustainability of our culture as part of our main mission and the stewardship of our natural resources. So a little bit about our organization. I know we have a mixed audience of members, sustainability specialists, energy specialists, a lot of diversity out there. The Minnesota Historical Society has over 26 historic sites throughout the state of Minnesota. And in those 26 sites, we have over 140 structures of varying sizes and ages. So we have anywhere from a large modern museum building like this one that's over 490,000 square feet, all the way to an early 1900s historic house that's less than 2,000 square feet. So it's quite the range of sizes, ages, systems. And we also get quite the range of visitors. We have 24,000 members, 400 staff, and many more volunteers, school children, researchers, and other visitors that visit our sites throughout the year. So in order to manage that portfolio of buildings and the diversity of activity that occurs on our sites, we utilize metrics to help us. We quantify our energy, waste, water, and resource uses, and that really allows us to bring all the efforts from our various sites and our various activities together. So in order to do that, we use greenhouse gas emissions as our primary sustainability metric, and we use that as a representation of our energy, water, waste, and resource consumption. And so our primary measurement can be seen across our different sites. So this is a map of all our sites, and in the gray is a representation of the total greenhouse gas emissions per site for energy, waste, and water across the state. And that gives us a great snapshot of our overall consumption, but we actually like to do a little bit more analysis. We take each site's greenhouse gas emissions, our sustainability metric, and normalize it by size of the building, so you can compare a large building, such as this one, to a small house structure. And we also normalize it by occupancy, because some of our sites get a lot more traffic than others. And so you can see at the top, these numbers reflect the Minnesota History Center. And then the third one down is actually the Lindberg House site. So it's a relatively small site compared to this, and yet it comes within the same scale of greenhouse gas emissions by size and by occupancy. And then when we do this, we start to see some other fun things too, like Split Rock Lighthouse. When we look at it by size, Split Rock uses a moderate amount of energy per square foot and a moderate amount of greenhouse gas emissions per square foot as well. But when we normalize by occupancy, it almost becomes a negligible number. It's so small. And that really helps us understand that a lot of what Split Rock faces in terms of environmental impact challenges is based on occupancy, just the influx of visitors at different parts of the day during the year. So all this data allows us to react and think of ways to reduce consumption and prioritize them based on their impact of reducing the environmental impact metric, our greenhouse gas emissions essentially. So we categorize our different strategies by short-term actions, which are easy to implement, low-hanging fruit essentially, less than 5-year payback periods. Long-term planning projects, which are larger scale projects that involve multiple departments, multiple stakeholders, and finally engagement projects that really are rooted in behavioral change strategies. So this table is just an example of how we can use this data to select the right strategies. We can go beyond just looking at best practices. The top 2 lines are LED projects at different sites. And the top one is an LED fixture replacement in our conservation storage areas in our sub-basements in this building. And you can see that from a short-term project planning perspective, it didn't quite make sense on the payback period, and it didn't make a large greenhouse gas emissions impact when compared to doing a similar LED lamp or bulb replacement in Split Rock Lighthouse's retail area of their visitor center. And so, we could do the same thing with a number of strategies, other LED kind of projects, other demand-based controllers. The other 3 projects listed below are based on occupancy controls. So it really allowed us to go beyond best practices to seeing what the impact of each strategy would have in a particular installation or a particular setup. We do the same thing with engagement strategies in a way. We quantify the possible reductions in cost as well as environmental impact, and we communicate that to our staff. So one of the examples up here is that we are able to reduce, if we're able to reduce 20% of our site-to-site meetings where we drive from here to Split Rock or from here to Northwest Fur Post, if we converted just 20% of those to web-based meetings, we would save $7,600 a year in fuel and mileage costs. And the cost of that would essentially be increasing the infrastructure for our web-based meetings, webcams, mics, things of that nature. So a lot of these engagement strategies are also rooted in the data that we collect and produce, and it really helps us communicate the impact that the staff can have as well as track progress over time. And then finally, the long-term planning process, our metrics also play a large role in that. In determining a project that may involve a lot of different departments, these data points help us have sustainability be represented at the table. The sustainability metrics turn into one of many metrics that are part of the decision-making process, ranging from overall cost, time to implement, maintenance, and even educational and communication opportunities. So these are the projects that are really about an integrated sustainability effort. So overall, after our first sustainability audit and the first set of strategies, which were over 75, we estimated that we would save $1.8 million in utility bills in the next 5 years and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 15%. But it's not just a one-time effort. We hope to keep doing that and keep using the data to propel more strategies over time in order to continue the progress of reducing environmental impact and overhead costs. So it's been about 2 years for this program, actually since I've started here as well, and we've really focused on the low-hanging fruit strategies, mostly the short-term projects. We're slowly getting into the engagement projects, such as this one this evening, and other staff-based engagement projects as well as policy too, and that's one of the things that we're going to be moving into in the next few phases. You can see that we're slowly bringing together more of the different strategies, and we hope that in our second sustainability audit, which is going to be coming out in January of the coming year, that we'll see a lot of improvements and measure the implementation changes that we've gotten over our projects. So that's a brief overview of the More for the Mission program. I and the Green Team in the audience encourage you to stay connected with us. We have a blog that you can follow, and we also have our emails up there, but we also have many social media outlets that you can find on the main mnhs.org website. So there's a lot of ways to contact and connect and stay connected to our project. So thank you.
Thanks, Shenying. My name is Nancy Lang, and I'm Manager of Policy and Engagement for Center for Energy's Innovation Exchange. And I want to thank the Minnesota Historical Society for hosting tonight's event, and we really applaud their efforts to create a more for the mission sustainability ethic. And we've been pleased to partner with them as they've improved energy efficiency in their buildings. And I think it reflects an interesting ethic of preservation. An agency that's charged with preserving Minnesota's cultural resources is also now making big strides in preserving Minnesota's natural resources. The Center for Energy and Environment has been around for about 30 years, and we launched the Innovation Exchange just this past year as a way to connect our building science expertise and our practical energy efficiency program activities with the broader community and efforts around energy in Minnesota. So when we did this launch, we had a lot of opportunities to be creative and think about how we wanted to represent ourselves programmatically and even visually. And we had some big empty walls in our new space. And we thought about our wonderful 30-year organizational history, and we thought we should really take a look at that and think about what that history means and how it fits into Minnesota's energy history. And so we spent some time with Hana's really good help, excellent research help, figuring out what that history was. And we have some long-term staff, our president and founder, Sheldon Strom, who many of you know, Martha Hewitt, our director of research, have been there for that entire time. But one thing kind of led to another, and we started digging into more than CEE energy history. We started thinking about how our work fits into the bigger Minnesota energy history storyline. So we created an energy history timeline, and we had a lot of fun with this project. And when we had a chance to talk to the History Center about their More for the Mission work, they said, hey, you should come present, it fits in. So that's why we're here tonight. With me is Anna Jurek, and Anna is a program assistant with the Innovation Exchange, and she's going to tell you just a little bit about CEE as an organization and our CEE history. And then Chris Plum is also here. Chris is the manager of the Public Building Energy Efficiency Program and is the one who has worked most closely with the Historical Society on commissioning this building to improve its efficiency. So when Anna's done, I'll tell you a little bit about the timeline, and we'll look at some snapshots and data points in there, and then Chris will tell you about the work to improve the efficiency of this building. So with that, I'll turn it over to Anna Jurek.
Hi, thank you all for coming tonight. So as Nancy said, I'm going to talk a little bit about our organizational history. And just to get started, the Center for Energy and Environment is a nonprofit with the mission to promote energy efficiency to strengthen the economy while improving the environment. And so we understand that when a homeowner or a business or a government reduces their energy use, they're also reducing their environmental impact and freeing up money for other investments. And as an organization, we run energy programs for electric and gas utilities as part of their conservation improvement program requirements. We perform research to test and apply the latest technologies to advance energy efficiency, and we offer financing options to remove one of the barriers to investing in energy improvements, and we also serve as expert resources for policymakers in the state of Minnesota. But why did we do this energy timeline project? Well, our organization has been working in energy efficiency for over 30 years, and a lot of our work has played a huge role in Minnesota's energy history, and many of our staff have lived a big chunk of it. In addition to that, our offices are located downtown Minneapolis in the Colonial Warehouse building, which used to house the Minneapolis streetcar system. So that's kind of an interesting tie-in to energy history in Minnesota. And we're also right on the Mississippi River, so we're close to Minneapolis's energy infrastructure. And with the launch of our new department, the Innovation Exchange, that department's missions is to share CEE's knowledge and expertise. And we were working on putting together an online resource center. But it was really challenging to organize our existing resources because much of the information wasn't on paper, it was in the heads of our staff people. So the Innovation Exchange took on an organizational history project. This is a first draft of a timeline of our programs and landmarks throughout the years. And we were really devoted to turning our organizational knowledge into resources for energy professionals who are also working in the efficiency field. And this led into the Minnesota Energy Timeline. And just to let all of you know, we are amateur historians, and so we were really interested in exploring the larger context and implications of our work, but we're by no means experts. So just to tell you a little bit about CE's history, we actually were founded in 1979 as the Minneapolis Energy Office. And Sheldon Strom was hired to start the Energy Office, and he's been leading our organization for 30 years, and many of our other staff have been around for almost as long. In 1980, we started our House Doctor program, which was using some pretty, at the time, innovative technologies, including the blower door and infrared viewers, to perform energy audits on Minneapolis homes. And that program also had a workforce training component to it. 1 year later, in 1981, we began neighborhood energy workshops, which were informational workshops and trainings for homeowners, and they used a community organizing model and empower people to really weatherize their own homes. So right from the start, CE has always had an emphasis on helping people while also saving energy. We became an independent nonprofit in 1989, and since then we've run several residential energy programs in Minnesota and also served as a resource for program design for groups out of state. And there's really been an emphasis on helping people take ownership over their own energy use, and whether that's providing materials like insulation or just explaining how to understand their energy use and energy bills in new ways. So we want to make it easy for people to reduce their energy use and empower them to change their behaviors. A lot of our programs actually are also focused on commercial buildings and small businesses. Since 2000, our one-stop efficiency shop, which is our largest commercial program, has been helping small businesses upgrade to more efficient lighting. And our one-stop model means that it also includes information about lighting and financing options, so that removes barriers such as lack of knowledge or immediate money to invest in energy improvements. And it's an example of a really strong and successful efficiency program that's helped businesses around the state upgrade to more efficient lighting. And over the years, we've also been involved in a number of existing building commissioning projects, which is helping existing buildings improve their energy performance, whether installing new equipment or changing their operations. We also have a very strong research division, and our research has always been about applying the latest technologies to advance energy efficiency. It's field-based, most of it, and CEE is really a living lab. And by that I mean that our research and our programs inform each other. So sometimes our field staff will give our researchers new ideas and vice versa. Our first report was published in 1984. It was about heating in multifamily buildings, and we've published over 100 reports since then. Most of them are about building science, but several have public health implications, especially dealing with indoor air quality. And we understand that it's more about making sure that buildings are energy efficient and have acceptable indoor air quality, because we also have to think about how building operators and homeowners understand their energy use. And because of that, we've always placed an emphasis on energy awareness and education. Nearly all of our residential energy programs have used a workshop model to teach people about how their homes use energy. And in 2006, we launched the Minnesota Energy Challenge, which is kind of our first foray into public education as opposed to direct energy savings programs. And it's all about providing resources and also generating excitement around saving energy, so making it more fun. And through the success and enthusiasm from the Energy Challenge fed into the 2011 launch of the Innovation Exchange. And this department is really committed to these kinds of educational initiatives, including last summer's public art project, Bicycling Counts, and our energy timeline. So with that, I'll turn it over to Nancy.
Hana is amazing because when she started a year ago, she was charged with compiling and synthesizing and documenting CEE's research projects, of which there were many dozens, and trying to categorize them. And so I appreciate her work and acknowledge that she has an interest in all kinds of arcane energy knowledge that as a young person, it's pretty impressive that she knows about condensing boilers and all kinds of things. But today we'll start with our energy timeline tonight. And it's, as I said, it's been a fun project. We're amateur historians, so we'll just present what we found and hope that it spurs some memories for you, or that you can think about your own intersection at points on this timeline. And our primary focus really is how Minnesota's electric system evolved. And when we considered the events kind of in a chronological fashion, we identified really 4 major eras. And so I'll just present a handful of snapshots for each of these 4 major eras. And of course, the first one is our energy foundation. And the development of Minnesota's electric energy infrastructure and really the development of our cities all grew out of our state's network of rivers. Sawmills and flour mills and industries were developed at the site of these falling waters to take advantage of the power that was just there, that nature had placed by geography at our beck and call. Here's a photo of the Ottertail River in Fergus Falls, Minnesota, where Ottertail Power Company is located. Here is a picture of the St. Anthony Falls, which I'm sure almost everyone is familiar with in Minneapolis area. Again, a huge development point for the city of Minneapolis. In Duluth, there was the St. Louis River that fueled a lot of growth in the northeastern part of the state. And think of all the lumber in northeastern Minnesota that was passed through that point on the St. Louis River. But even tiny little rivers like the Cannon River in Northfield had hydropower projects on them. My first job out of college was at Malto-Meal Cereal, and they had an old mill on the Cannon River right there where they apparently used to grind the farina before they had electricity to do it. But it wasn't long until hydroelectric projects started to emerge on these waterways. And in 1882, the first hydroelectric power plant in the U.S. was actually built in Minneapolis at the St. Anthony Falls. And it began to supply electricity to businesses along Washington Avenue. I was able to get a handful of pictures from Minnesota Power, and this was one of a number of impressive pictures of the construction of the Thompson Dam on the St. Louis River. At that time, it was the Great Northern Power Company, which was later to become Minnesota Power. This was, when it was constructed in 1880, or no, it was beyond 1882, I'm sorry, it was early 1900s. It was the largest hydroelectric project in the world, and it still is the largest hydroelectric project still operating in Minnesota. I think as a staff, we enjoyed finding the city scenes in Minneapolis. Those were some of our favorite photos, and we tapped into the great archives of the Historic Society here. You could chew up, an hour would go by and you would realize, okay, I just have to pick one. So we picked this one because this represented a very typical early end use for electricity in Minneapolis and other cities, and that was street lighting, replacing the gas lights and improving public safety. We also kind of got a kick out of the fact of the design looks like a modern cell phone tower, so I don't know if which design was copied, but nonetheless. Oops. Oh. Yeah, my slide was out of order, so sorry. This is, I'm just going to go ahead one and then back to this. This is another street scene. This is on Washington Avenue, and again, you can see infrastructure development that's building up around electricity, and particularly interesting here because it's electric transportation with the streetcars coming into place. And as Hana said, our building housed some of the first streetcars in Minneapolis. I'm going to back up now to this project. Hydroelectric projects were soon followed by steam generating power plants, which were fueled primarily by coal. And the first large-scale power plant was built in 1911 in northeast Minneapolis, the Riverside power plant. And it generated about 12 megawatts of electricity, which is very tiny by today's standards. But what's interesting about the Riverside plant is it expanded and continued to operate and burn coal until just a few years ago when Xcel Energy replaced it with a natural gas power plant. Natural gas, we didn't spend a lot of time digging into that, but we were so intrigued by this photo from the 1930s. This was a picture of obviously laying gas pipeline, but it wasn't the natural gas that we think of today. It was manufactured gas that came from, it was produced by using coal or other petroleum products. Eventually, the natural gas pipelines from the Gulf Coast were extended to Minnesota, and soon these pipelines were carrying the natural gas product that we know, but early on it was not the natural gas that we know of today. Northern States Power was brought into existence in 1916, actually by a protege of Thomas Edison's, a man by the name of H.M. Bilsby. He was like a utility dynamo. All across the Midwest, he created tiny little utilities, and then he'd move on and create tiny more, and finally started to conglomerate them into bigger utilities, and one of them was Northern States Power. But another interesting fact we found out is that all Minnesota utilities kind of were a amalgam, if you will, of these tiny little utilities that were operating in towns or maybe a couple towns. So it was a story of consolidation, really, for these utilities. This is another photo from Minnesota Power, which early on, these utilities started marketing their products to consumers. And here, clearly, they're targeting housewives with electric appliances that can make their lives better. And they even had, Minnesota Power even had home energy advisors that would go to your home. They had a car with a big logo on the side, and they'd deliver an electric toaster to your home. So that was fun to find that fact out. I love this photo. When we saw this, it was like, hey, come here, you gotta see this photo. Because who doesn't know Redikilowatt? But I did not know that Redikilowatt appeared first in 1926. And he was licensed to over 300 electric companies for promotion. And then finally, Northern States Power bought the rights to Redikilowatt in 1998. Up until this point, of course, electricity primarily benefited city dwellers. But in 1935, the federal government enacted the Rural Electrification Act to provide funding for the installation of the electric system to serve rural areas. I think of all the each era had kind of a really interesting point for me, and of course for me, this was, I think, the most interesting point of the early era. Most of Minnesota's rural electric cooperatives were formed at this time and have been in existence for about 75 years. And the other interesting thing I found out is that this didn't happen overnight, that these lines, just appeared in the countryside in a couple years. I read stories online of soldiers who went away to World War II, so that was in the 40s, and when they came back, they were amazed by what a difference their farms were experiencing because of electricity. And I bet if you have relatives that lived on farms during that period, if you ask them about when electricity came to their farms, almost every single one of them will remember it because it was an event. So we're going to move to the next era, which we called steel in the ground. It was really a period of rapid growth in the electric utility industry in Minnesota because there was such an economic boom after World War II that electricity demand was just growing in leaps and bounds. And new coal and nuclear plants came online in really rapid succession in Minnesota. Demand for electricity in the US was doubling about every 10 years as electric end uses just expanded. And utilities invested their ratepayer dollars in a series of really massive infrastructure projects. And this is the Prairie Island nuclear plant, which was built in 1973, which was kind of at the end of this era. It is 1,000 megawatts, so it's very large, enough to power about 1 million homes. These plants really formed the foundation of Minnesota's electric generating system, and interestingly enough, most of them are still operating today. This is the Black Dog Power Plant on the Minnesota River that was built in 1952. Part of it now has been converted to natural gas, and Xcel Energy, which owns this plant, would like to convert the remaining coal units to natural gas soon. Of course, the marketing efforts continued, again focused on, in this case, housewives. And at the same time, a regulatory framework was strengthened as the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission was created to govern rates and infrastructure investments. And I don't think the Public Utilities Commission is probably a very well-known body of regulation in Minnesota, but it is one of the most influential bodies affecting the energy choices that are made in Minnesota and the rates we pay for energy. And the legislature gives a lot of direction to our Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. There's 5 bipartisan members, and they are appointed by the governor. Electric utility infrastructure, of course, includes more than just power plants. And in the late 1970s, one of Minnesota's most contentious energy infrastructure projects arose over the construction of a high-voltage power line across western Minnesota. I'm sure many of you that were alive and living in Minnesota remember this. This power line was intended to link a new coal power plant that was being built in North Dakota to the load centers in the Twin Cities. Farmers were very concerned about the power line's impact on their farming operations and on their health, and power line protests engulfed rural communities along the proposed route. Is there a tongue twister on this one? Paul Wellstone, I'm sure many of you probably know that this is where he kind of cut his teeth as a community organizer, and he ended up writing a book about his experiences. The protesters were known as bolt weevils, and they destroyed equipment and they tore down power line towers in an attempt to prevent construction. Eventually, the governor called out 200 state troopers to ensure that the construction would continue, and eventually the completed line was connected to North Dakota's Coal Creek Station power plant. The third era that we spent time with was an era that we're calling Reimagining Growth, which we say roughly began in the 1970s and continues to today. So while post-World War II America, energy consumption was increasing in lockstep with production of wealth, but by the 1970s, the utility industry's grow and build strategy was really being transformed by a number of market forces and political forces. This chart, it's the only chart in the presentation, which for a CEE presentation is really good, just to have one chart. This chart shows energy consumption in blue, and it shows GDP in pink. And you'll notice that the link between energy consumption and GDP started to pull apart by the mid-1970s. And what this chart demonstrates is that our economy was becoming more energy efficient. We were using less energy than before to produce each unit of economic growth. So what were these forces that reshaped our nation's energy economy? Well, some of these forces included the rise of the Middle Eastern oil cartel, OPEC, that exercised its market muscles for political purposes. Domestic energy supplies were dwindling and prices were rising. And at the same time, there was a rise of the environmental movement that drove policies to reduce pollution. The Clean Air Act was enacted in 1970 and radically shifted some of the fuel choices that utilities were making away from coal and to oil. But these market forces eventually converged, and energy price hikes rippled throughout the economy and caused inflation to spike. So I think anyone over the age of 40, maybe 45, might remember Jimmy Carter's fireside chat, which actually occurred in 1977 after the energy crisis was already over and the gas lines had disappeared. President Carter was really convinced that the U.S. needed to change its energy habits, and he told the country, quote, that he wanted to have an unpleasant talk with you about a problem unprecedented in our history. With the exception of preventing war, this is the greatest challenge our country will face during our lifetimes. He warned that the era of abundant, cheap energy was over and that the country needed to balance, quote, our energy demand with our rapidly shrinking resources. He called for a new conservation ethic. He launched policies to advance energy efficiency and spur energy self-sufficiency through the expansion of domestic energy supplies. He linked wasteful energy use to degradation of the environment and energy conservation to the creation of new jobs. I know President Carter has been criticized over the years because he cast conservation as a deprivation and a call for joint sacrifice. That some people quibble with that and say that was really the wrong way to frame conservation and efficiency. But if you go back and read his remarks, I was really struck by how comprehensive and forward-looking they were. And by 2012, we've actually accomplished some of his goals. Now, he had set the goals for 1985, but we have accomplished some of them. And he's still alive to see that, so that's pretty cool, I think. When Snoopy starts talking about a subject, I think you know that it's become part of America's mainstream conversation, too. And I put this slide in. I don't know if you can read that little tagline on the bottom, but check out what was considered fuel efficient in 1975. It says, a sobering thought from the car that gives you 25 miles to the gallon. That was actually the car I learned how to drive in, so it's kind of near and dear to my heart. In Minnesota, state policies were also enacted, including legislation requiring that Minnesota utilities pilot energy conservation programs for the first time. Here we have a picture of Governor Rudy Perpich signing an Energy Emergency Act dealing with energy supplies in the case of shortages. As Hana said, Operation Insulation, sponsored by CEE's predecessor, the Minneapolis Energy Office, was there to help diagnose waste and assist homeowners. And CEE has really, as Hana said, devoted a lot of time and effort to understand how buildings use energy, buildings of all types, multifamily, big commercial buildings, and single-family homes. And I'm not an engineer, and I'm fairly new to CEE, but I've learned a lot about how complicated buildings are just since I've been at CEE. There were Minnesota companies that really stepped up and developed energy conservation technologies like Honeywell's thermostat. I guess that is a programmable thermostat, I'm not sure. But it's some kind of thermostat that uses time to set temperature. I think that's newer than the one I might have had on my wall, but. And then Anderson Windows developed their low E high efficiency windows. Let's see, later in this year, energy growth is being reconsidered again, but this time we're using a different metric, and the context is of rising carbon dioxide emissions, primarily associated with the burning of fossil fuels. International efforts to address climate change were launched in the early 1990s, and even local governments became engaged in efforts to reduce carbon emissions. And CEE helped Minneapolis and St. Paul prepare these carbon reduction plans. Minnesota's climate change planning led to the passage of the Next Generation Energy Act in 2007. And the act set carbon reduction goals for Minnesota and even stronger energy efficiency standards, spurring electric and gas utilities to further expand their energy efficiency programs. And I was pleased to see one of the legislative champions of these efforts in the audience tonight, Representative Bill Hilty from the Sandstone area. So, I have to give a shout out to Representative Hilty because he worked tirelessly and believed very firmly that Minnesota was on better footing when they took care of their energy resources. Once launched, Minnesota never really abandoned its energy conservation priorities. Our energy policies clearly articulate that energy efficiency is a priority resource because it is Minnesota's cheapest and cleanest source of new energy supply. These conservation programs, which have now been running for over 20 years, have achieved impressive results, saving the equivalent of the output of about 2 Prairie Island nuclear plants. Xcel Energy's cost for its energy efficiency programs is less than 2 cents a kilowatt hour, while we as retail customers pay about 8 cents a kilowatt hour. As Hana said, CEE runs Xcel Energy's one-stop lighting program for small commercial businesses. And just in 2011 alone, changing out light bulbs in small commercial buildings saved the output equivalent to about 11 utility-scale wind turbines, and at half the cost. So that, and of course, we'll hear about efforts to improve efficiency in buildings from Chris in just a minute. So that brings us to our last era, and we're calling this new energy sources. I love this picture. This is the port of Duluth, which has become very busy as wind turbines and wind turbine parts, I guess, are being shipped from Europe through the port. Minnesota's electricity needs have been met primarily by using imported fuels, including coal and natural gas and uranium, and even imported hydropower from Canada. But that picture is shifting. While 10 years ago, coal provided about 65% of Minnesota's electricity, today coal supplies about half, and our state's energy portfolio is increasingly integrating renewable energy resources like wind. And Minnesotans have long relied on wind to pump water and generate electricity, but the scale of wind power potential was much more clearly understood beginning in the 1980s when wind speeds were monitored. And in the southwest region of the state, which is known as the Buffalo Ridge, it became apparent that there were very high wind speeds and that we ought to be taking advantage of them. A watershed event occurred in Minnesota's energy path in 1994 when Northern States Power sought authorization from the Minnesota legislature to store spent nuclear fuel at its Prairie Island nuclear plant. The request sparked really heated debate. I was working in the energy world, and I know it was very contentious and very painful because there was questions over the risks of nuclear power. There were questions over imposing those risks on the Prairie Island tribal community. And then there were questions about the choice Minnesota was making to meet its energy needs. And while the nuclear storage was eventually approved, the legislature ordered that Xcel procure hundreds of megawatts of wind energy, and it banned the construction of any new nuclear power plants, and that ban is still in place today. And this was game-changing policy, though, that really launched Minnesota's wind energy development. And here you'll see on the left-hand side the first large wind farm, which was constructed in Lincoln County, and its 25 megawatts of electricity was sold to Northern States Power. On the right-hand side, you'll see the Taconite Ridge wind farm, which is owned by Minnesota Power, and was commissioned in 2011. And I just think I tried to find some photos that had the same scale of turbine, but I'm sure you can tell from the size of the trees that these are much larger turbines capable of producing about 8 times the electricity as the turbines on the left. And solar energy systems, once the technology of folks that wanted to get off the grid and be independent, are now growing in size and being deployed on homes and government buildings and businesses. And this is a 600 kilowatt system on the roof of the Minneapolis Convention Center. So 70 years ago, this is what wind energy looked like in Minnesota. Minnesota's Jacobs Wind began manufacturing small little wind turbines, and they're still in business today. And here's what wind energy looks like today. So if you can think about that change and transformation in a technology like wind energy in 70 years, it's really, I think, exciting to think about 70 years forward and what the technologies will be using in 70 years. So that's a conclusion of our timeline journey, brings us to the present date, and I hope it kind of sparked some memories for you. Our timeline is online at this place. You'll see here this address, and there's a place for you to put comments in, and we'd love to hear your energy stories. It's fun for us to hear what your memories are. We have a lot of great online resources at the Innovation Exchange page. We have a twice weekly blog. We're putting on webinars, and we're doing some innovative data visualization, energy data visualizations. So that concludes my energy timeline presentation. So thank you. And I'll welcome Chris up to the podium. There you go. Yep.
Have to find out where that is. There. First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming out on a beautiful day, but when the roads were really lousy, and persevering to get here. It may not be the early settlers, but nonetheless, it was a journey. It seemed like it would be a good thing, along with the timeline, to talk about a resource that Nancy did mention as being the least expensive resource having to do with energy, and one that we often may somewhat misunderstand, which is conservation. And particularly to look at the building that you're sitting in right now as an example of energy conservation sort of at its finest. And this is due to the work of the people at the History Center. The graph here shows the energy use of this building starting in 2006, which is taken as a baseline year. And the red part of the graph is natural gas, and the blue part is electricity. And what you see is that in the last 6 years, the energy use in this building has gone down by almost 60%. And it's not because you're totally freezing to death in here, although it's cool because we thought there might be more people here, so you don't want it to get too hot. But just a large number of things done by the staff, and especially the State's Department of Plant Management in this building. This is a 20-year-old building with about 500,000 square feet in it. So it's, counts as a big building. A lot of people have been involved in this work. I'm not going to read you their names, but they're listed here. There have been a number of projects and a lot of Minnesota companies involved. And just want to thank all of them for their work. I think one thing that didn't necessarily come out from the, shall we say, excuses that both Hana and Nancy made about their presentation is that an amateur is somebody that loves what they're doing. And so we would also say that even though working in the energy conservation field, we're supposed to be professionals, we really do what we do because we're amateurs. So what was done in this building, just from a practical perspective? Equipment was upgraded in 2008. The building is now about 20 years old, and this was just equipment that reached the end of its normal life. And there have been significant advances made in the control of electronic equipment in buildings, I liken it to cars. You know, Nancy showed the picture of the Volkswagen before, and a lot of us remember cars of that period. You kind of had to get a tune-up at least once a year in your car, or it degraded rapidly in performance. You know, how many people go in for that tune-up on their car anymore? You don't. The car's computer takes care of it. Well, in the 1990s, buildings were about where our cars were in the 70s, and they are now coming to the point that we've gotten used to in things like automobiles. And computers can really do a great job, a much better job than we can do of sort of keeping up with things. But they have to be there, and you have to put equipment in place. And so the major investment was made in this building in about 2006. And following that, and that led to about a 20% energy saving just by better equipment that could make things run as you wanted them to. The plant management staff then looked at everything and said, well, how can we do even better than that? And these are really people just doing what you do in your own home. How do I operate it a little bit differently? If I'm not somewhere, how do I turn off the lights? How do I turn the heat down? Any of those sorts of things. Finally, 2 years ago, the program that I work with, the Public Buildings Enhanced Energy Efficiency Program, looked at this building and said, well, we think now we can kind of come in and tune up all that work and get it as close to the way you'd like it to operate in the first place. That found about another 10% in energy savings. And finally, the lighting in the building is being upgraded over the course of the next year, and that'll lead to another 5 to 10% in savings. Doing the sort of thing that most of you have done in your own homes, you know, putting in this case, not compact fluorescent light bulbs, because I think we all know, like, our shirts look a different color some days with them than they do when we walk outside and so on. In a museum environment, that's not acceptable. High-quality LED lights allow for really good colors of things and also much lower energy use. So typically, the kind of thing that was done was we adjusted the schedule of how much heat and cooling is going on in this building. The History Center has an incredibly variable population of people. So you can think of, again, it's a lot like your own home. How many people are there at noon? How many people are there in the evening? How many are there on the weekend versus a weekday, and so on? The population in this building goes up and down based on weekends, weekdays, school years, and then the event that goes off the charts is Black Friday, which is the biggest day for the museum, as Karen Nichols will tell you, with about 3,000 people being here the day after Thanksgiving, compared to normal occupancy of perhaps 700 or 800 on a weekday, with school groups and so on coming through. So what we really did is plan things so that you have the most energy used when you have the most people to take care of, and schedule things accordingly. An example is there's classrooms in the building. The classrooms are normally used in the daytime for certain events, but sometimes something happens at night. Well, it's pretty hard to schedule for sometimes something happens at night. And what was done is there's now a special button in the classrooms. So if you have a night class and there's a lot of people and it starts to get stuffy and you hit the button, it starts running everything, and it takes the air, it circulates the air better in the room. And you don't notice the fact that it's crowded and stuffy, but when the people aren't there, it just sort of stays shut down, just like your house does when you're not at home. Another measure, and this one might count as truly low-hanging fruit, was putting low-flow faucet aerators in all the lavatories in the building. Well, you know, that sounds like, what's the big deal? Those cost $4 or $5 a piece. In this building, there's 24 lavatories. And during the week, there's a lot of school kids who come in and they all wash their hands. We conservatively said that there's about 5 minutes an hour of hot water running in those lavatories. I would guess it's probably a lot more than that. So the faucet aerators in this building will save 200,000 gallons of hot water a year. So that's saving energy and saving water. So it's sort of a double hit from an ecological perspective. And it's obviously something you can do at your own home. Overall, as a bigger picture for the state, some of you may be familiar with the fact that the governor has signed a so-called governor's order challenging all state buildings to reduce their energy use by 20% over their baseline level. Have a plan for how to do that in the foreseeable future. This building is one of, is it 23 on the state capitol complex? 17, sorry, Chris. With about 4 million square feet of buildings. And these buildings are already 25% below their baseline levels. So they've already surpassed what the governor is calling for all public buildings to do in the state. Now, the future of energy, as Nancy said, includes efficiency as well as renewable energy. And an integrated design process, which means as new buildings are built, you think about all these things at the same time. And many of you are probably familiar with the fact that IKEA has put solar panels on the roof of their store down in Bloomington. To give you an idea of that, these are the facts that they say. It's 140,000 square feet of solar panels, 4,000 solar panels. They have an output of 1 megawatt. It sounds pretty impressive. The amount of solar panel that is installed on the roof of IKEA, which is twice what was on the Minneapolis Convention Center in Nancy's slide, would produce about 1/7 of the energy that's used in this building in a year. And that's 1/7 of what it uses now after all the energy improvements. So this is the reason why efficiency remains such a huge picture of energy generation, because relative to even renewable sources, it's just far less expensive and it's achievable. The other thing I'd like to just mention is all publicly funded building projects in Minnesota now have some guidelines called SB 2030, which stands for Sustainable Building 2030, that go into their design. And this is a systematic approach to basically decarbonize the footprint of all publicly funded buildings. And that's represented, again, way more charts, so I made up for Nancy's chart-free presentation. Through two different things. The black part of the bar is carbon-based fuel, and that shows the reductions in actual use in the last 10 years from the year 2000, and then in future use based on design planning. And some of that will be replaced by renewable energies, and that's what the green component of the pictures are. But the greater portion of it will be achieved by not using any energy at all, because the energy that's used will be used more wisely, and the energy that wasn't needed in the first place just won't get used at all. And that's through conservation and so-called integrated design. And that's what I've got.
Okay, so we're only 3 minutes past 7, so we have some time for questions for all of us. There's 2 wireless mics. Do you think I could have a volunteer perhaps walk around with a mic? So, yeah, if you have questions for any 4 of us, we'll start now.
Hello, my name is Sean. I'm with the Alliance for Sustainability, and we would love the History Center to do other events like this related to our transportation history. We used to have all the streetcars as well as all of our agricultural history of all the truck farms in the Twin Cities. And but one of the things I wanted to ask Nancy and the other panelists is related to the messages we're getting from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in terms of how fast the world should accelerate, decreasing carbon in order to stave off some of the things like permafrost melting and a lot of the bad cascading cycles of going up to 2 degrees temperature increase. So I'm wondering if CE was able to run the state of Minnesota, or if we could have instantly all of Germany's policies transported here, What could we do in Minnesota to actually get the carbon reductions that the global scientists are telling us that we should achieve?
I think I'm going to have to stand up for that one. It's nice to see you, Sean. Sean is a great advocate for sustainability, and he's connects youth and churches, and he works on these issues tirelessly. So one of the things, of course, is people like you making it happen. But Minnesota has carbon reduction goals. They are just goals at this point, and our progress to achieving those goals is not completely on track. We have goals for efficiency that we're meeting pretty well. We have goals for renewable energy, 25% of our electricity coming from renewable resources by 2025. I forgot to mention that. We're on track to meet that, but that's not going to be enough. And I know that Minnesota has grappled with what can we as a state do. The Midwestern Governors Association even developed a carbon cap and trade model rule several years ago, and I think Minnesota was thinking about or poised to pass a model rule, but Minnesota is like a little entity in terms of its carbon emissions. And so I think what we've tried to do as a state is get our own house in order, and we need to do better to get our own house in order. I guess that's maybe my opinion as opposed to CEE's complete organizational opinion, but I think Minnesota needs to, think about how carbon can be infused into our economy as a price signal. Again, I'm not saying that's CEE's policy, but until we understand the price of adding carbon to our atmosphere, we can continue to pretend that it's not there. Now, how that could happen as a state policy, I'm not sure, and I am hopeful that there will be renewed enthusiasm to solve this problem when you have impacts like Hurricane Sandy and heat waves and droughts that are really starting to make people's lives very miserable. So, probably an adequate answer, Sean, but on the spur of the moment, that's about the...
System can automatically get a decent rate of return on that. So we'd like to ask John Murray, our new energy chair guy, to hopefully look at a feed-in tariff this year.
My name's Jim Butcher. I basically got a couple of comments, really more from a sort of consumer pocketbook issue, but relating to energy nonetheless, and maybe these comments may feed into your strategy. I live about 100 miles north of here, so my electricity comes from a rural cooperative. And we're all being exhorted to put in, energy-conserving light bulbs and replace the old refrigerator with new Energy Star and all this good stuff. But the unit cost of electricity keeps on going up. And when queried as to why that is, well, because you're using less. And to make matters even worse, people like GRE build a brand new coal-fired power plant in Spiritwood, and immediately it's completed, it's mothballed, yet the rest of us are expected to pay for it. And then there's just the second issue, with regard to residential, certainly building conservation. I was reading a residential building journal the other day, and they were talking about the upcoming changes to the residential building code. And I guess we all think energy is a good thing, but there were some comments from some pretty significant contractors in the building trade, and they were concerned that we're getting to the point now that we're going to start specifying such tight, insulation requirements and everything that the payback period for these buildings is actually going to get very much extended. And so, as an average pocketbook issue, you perhaps not going to see some of these benefits that will end up being mandated. Just a couple of food for thoughts.
I have a comment, but please give it a try.
Let's see, Jim, I guess a couple of comments for you. First of all, I do understand the price comment. I think efficiency gets a little bit of, it's an easy target when utility prices have to go up. I think as most people know, the portion of the utility that you pay for that's due to the operating expense of buying fuel and so on is a fairly minimal cost to the utility. I mean, their major cost is high-cost assets that cost them the same whether or not you use any energy or not. And so to some degree, those utility costs are probably going to rise as they have for years, just as the consumer price index rises. It's also true that as things become more efficient, if they sell less electric, that fixed cost will be spread over smaller units and the cost will go up. Having said that, if you've invested in efficiency, you're going to pay a smaller increase than the person who hasn't. The other piece of your question fed right into that, which is, well, the paybacks are so long. Well, the paybacks are so long because energy is so cheap. Your German friends that we just mentioned, I think, are also paying at least double, if not more than that, in terms of unit energy costs, whether it's electric, gas, natural gas, or fuel for automobiles, which is one reason that they can and will invest in efficiency so much. The more positive side of that is if you look at the SB 2030 guidelines, the plans that the state is already following and so on, they meet all these targets. I mean, they are going towards zero energy on their buildings. They are going to using renewables and reducing all those costs. The other thing I'd note is the United States, from a greenhouse gas production perspective, has actually declined. Our peak year was about 2 years ago, and production in this country has gone down slightly each year. World production continues to rise, and the reason the technology work that we're doing and is being supported here by our utilities, the state and so on, is so important, as it is in countries like Germany, is because those technology advances need to be brought to the fast-growing parts of the third world and made affordable, so that as they grow to use as much energy per person as we expect to use in this country, the impact will be much smaller than it was in our growth period.
Can I just make one more comment, please? Coming back to strategy. I mean, you showed a graph showing electrical consumption is going down.
Oh, I'm sorry, do you mind using the mic so it can be recorded too?
Sorry, you showed a graph earlier, as we all know, showing the electrical consumption in this country is going down. So, but coming back to strategy, how can somebody build a power plant that's not required, yet the consumer, of course, ends up paying for it?
Well, in the case of Great River Energy, they are not a rate-regulated utility by the Public Utilities Commission. They are, in essence, regulated by their owner cooperatives, by their board of directors. And so GRE, as I understand it, made that decision to build that power plant, you know, within its own decision-making framework. I think it is a decision that they regret, perhaps, because they are now paying debt service on a power plant that they're not able to operate. In the case of rate-regulated utilities, which are like Xcel and Minnesota Power and Otter Tail Power, they go through a resource planning process where they have to very closely examine their load forecast and build or not build resources depending on what that load forecast looks like. Great River Energy, I think, was very surprised by the fact that their load growth has dropped as significantly as it has. And I think they built that power plant with the assumption that was probably in previous years a fairly safe assumption that load growth would just continue to increase at a certain rate. The other good news, I think, on efficiency and rates is that even if you never participate in an energy efficiency program, your rates are lower than they would be if efficiency had never been done. So that is because Xcel Energy, for example, using them, picking on them or highlighting them, when they've avoided 2 Prairie Island nuclear plants, they've avoided that investment in 2 Prairie Island nuclear plants that would be reflected in your rates So rates would be even higher today than they are if we hadn't done any efficiency. But it's not easily transparent to people, and that's part of our job at CEE, to make that more transparent to people. And my colleague Jenny Edwards and I are working on something that we hope will illuminate that for people very soon.
I came to this building today to look at the 1862 exhibit, and here I am asking a question on energy. But I have a question. A couple of years ago, CenterPoint Energy tried, I think on a test basis, a new rate system where homeowners like me would be charged at a higher rate for higher levels of usage. And I was so disappointed that it was mothballed. Is there any, can you talk about that a little bit, and can we get it back to some degree?
You guys know a lot about energy policy. Gosh, you're like picking all the winners or the not winners. But that was an experimental rate design in CenterPoint Energy. It was called an inverted block rate, meaning the more you used, the more you paid for that usage. And it was a test, it was a pilot project, and apparently the Attorney General's office got all kinds of complaints from people. Some of it was just a billing system. Sometimes they didn't read the meters within 30 days, and so people's usage looked like it was actually more than it was. So there were some of those like procedural problems. But then there were other people who just said, you know, I'm sick, or I'm old and I can't turn down my heat, or I've done everything for efficiency, I can't do more, I shouldn't be penalized. And this was one of those decisions that ultimately went to the Public Utilities Commission, and they agreed that the rate should be suspended. Having said that, however, in places where rates are higher, including places like California, there are things that are called time of use rates, I think is one way to characterize them. And those are if you are using electricity in times of the day when electricity is expensive, and I bet you all can figure out that that's like July at 5 o'clock on a weekday, you will pay more. And I was encouraged to learn about the fact that Minnesota utilities have the ability to offer time of day rates to their customers, and they do have them in place, but not many people use them. I think their design can be refined and made better, but the CenterPoint rate controversy was I think kind of an unfortunate toe in the water, because it left maybe a bad taste in people's mouth. And I hope we have another run at charging energy to reflect its real cost, and that part of that is how much you use and when you use it.
Hello, my name is Shannon O'Brien, and I have two questions. One is, why were they protesting the building of the power line from North Dakota to here? And two, you mentioned during President Carter's fireside talk the goals that he laid out, that several of them have been achieved, and I was just wondering which ones are those?
As I understand the power line protests, it was, again, a number of factors, but farmers, by and large, the majority or the protesting farmers just didn't want these on their land. They were concerned about the health impacts. They were concerned because their land was being taken by eminent domain. That's another thing that the Public Utilities Commission has the power to do, which is cite transmission lines and say where that transmission line is going to go. They have siting and routing authority. And if you're a landowner who doesn't want a transmission line on your property, and you've been told that your land will be used for that purpose, I think that engendered a lot of animosity. I think utilities have gotten more smart and cooperative about how they work with landowners, But I think it was just a convergence of animosity to the project and the process. One of the goals that President Carter set that I remembered saying, hey, I think we've met that, is that electricity demand should grow at 2% or less per year. And we are now growing at around less than 1% a year, at least in Minnesota. When you think about electricity doubling every 10 years or growing at 10%, 1% is really low comparatively. And so that was a goal that I saw that we met. There was a production of petroleum goal that I'm sure we weren't meeting until the hydraulic fracking has released lots and lots of oil that we didn't know we had. But certainly in terms of oil self-sufficiency, that is a goal that I don't know in terms of millions of barrels whether we're meeting that goal. But it seemed to me when I read it that we are approaching a much different situation with domestic oil than when President Carter was in place. But I'd be happy to send you the link, or you could just look up his remarks and see which ones ring true for you.
So my name is Ron Thury. I'm representing myself. Anyway, I see a lot of this. I'm involved in renewable energy. I talked to several people on your board myself from a standpoint of a company. But what I see there in terms of the economic factors that you have there, say you have that divergence of energy and use with the GDP, and you made the contention that was because of energy conservation, which I support fully, but I'm just wondering how much of that had to do with changes in our economy going to a service-based economy versus a manufacturing-based economy, which I think makes a tremendous amount of that divergence obvious. And the second thing, which is just relatively a comment, I guess, Californians pay 35 cents per kilowatt hour. We pay 8 cents a kilowatt hour. And the socioeconomic factors of where people are choosing to site their companies, that makes a big difference. So just wanting to have, we all want inexpensive energy and we want to conserve it, but if you're a company owner, you should take that into account. Cheap energy grows the economy. And that brings up the last point, which is you're saying that our energy use is only growing at 1% a year, but look at our economy in the last couple of years. It's really hasn't really grown. You can say that it contracted. And what would you say is the correlation between just our overall macroeconomic factor of our economy isn't growing very well with our energy use as opposed to the conservation or we're conserving energy?
That's a great question, and it's one that Xcel Energy is grappling with. I've understood that when they look at their load forecasts and they take out energy efficiency, they're still not growing very much. And so I think they believe that some of it is the economy, but I also think they believe that something is different. And they are trying to understand why their load growth is flattening out and not rebounding as the economy is starting to recover. And it's not just a trend in Minnesota. I think across the country, utilities are starting to see load growth flatten. And it could really change the shape of how utilities earn money. Because right now they earn money by selling more kilowatt hours, at least in most regimes. And cheap energy is, it is an engine of growth, and I think it's something that is cheap in part because of good policies in the state of Minnesota. And I think, boy, I don't know what to say beyond thinking that, again, energy that doesn't reflect the full cost of the resource to society ultimately isn't cheap, because you pay one place or you pay another place. But I've talked a lot, so I'm going to turn it over to somebody else.
I'd make one other comment, which is a program that again, DOE coordinates, called Save Energy Now, is a commercial and industrial program, and Xcel Energy also has its own commercial and industrial programs. The businesses that spend less on energy make more money. So cheap energy and efficiency, even if it's expensive energy, if they're more efficient than their competitors, they have an advantage in business, because paying for inefficient processes is basically wasting money. So you will find that energy efficiency is something that most industries are pursuing, and I think that there's a lot now that there's an organization called the American Council on an Energy Efficiency Economy, or ACEEE we call it, and there are quite a few studies that show that while over a long time there seems to have been a correlation between increased energy use and increased economic growth, that was a coincidence and not a causative relationship, and that in fact growth and making more money can happen even though energy use does not go up. And energy per unit of production is a big metric now in the leading, especially here in the Twin Cities. A lot of the businesses look at that.
Good evening. Thank you so much for hosting this. This is really an exciting night. My name is Diana McEwen, and I work for a program called Clean Energy Resource Teams, or CERTs. We help communities with local clean energy projects. And CERTs doesn't do any policy work, but in a former life, I did policy work, and I worked with Nancy a lot on some of the things she talked about tonight. And I'm curious, because the package in 2007 that Representative Hilty and I think Representative Kalin just walked out the door were big forces behind, was a huge suite of energy policy that in a generation probably you wouldn't see. And I'm curious if with this new session coming up, if the folks at CE and others that might work on policy in the room think that there's some other big pieces missing that we need to kind of go after, or is there still some enforcement or work on the current suite of policies that we have in place as we move into the 2013 session?
Well, I, again, am pretty new to CEE, and so I will speak kind of as from an observer for many years of the energy policy world. I don't know that CEE has defined any particular policies that need necessarily to be enacted in this upcoming session, but I think enforcement of existing policies, it's like exciting and wonderful to pass a bill, and it's a ton of work to make sure the bill gets implemented. And one of the things that advocates and organizations like CEE do is make sure that when utilities run energy efficiency programs, they're cost effective and they're really saving energy. And so that's huge. Is our renewable energy standard really delivering the kilowatt hours that it's supposed to be delivering? I think, Minnesota in 2007 set carbon reduction goals, and they're important goals, and I would personally hope that, again, the legislature, with some leadership from Governor Dayton and key policymakers, could take a look at those goals and see, how close are we to meeting them, how much farther do we need to go, and what can fill that gap. Because carbon is a metric that I believe the world is going to have to listen to.
All right, so we could take one very brief last question, and otherwise you can save your questions for individual time afterwards.
Thank Thank you. I just had a question coming back to something you mentioned about whether renewable energy standards were actually meeting their targets. I mean, everyone cites wind turbines as having a very high availability factor, but their capacity factor, from what I've read, is extremely low. And just as an anecdotal, I've been to Palm Springs twice. That valley is covered with windmills. The twice I've been there, most of them have been stationary. So, I mean, do you have an idea for Minnesota what our actually capacity factor is for the installed wind power?
Yeah, the capacity factor of wind, it's interesting when utilities do these resource plans, and now that wind is a real deal in their resource mix, they have to say wind is going to account for this many thousands of megawatts of our power. And I think the capacity factor they use and that the Public Utilities Commission and our state division of energy resources wants them to use is about 15%. I think that's correct. Is that right, Lester? Okay. Diana would know. Yeah. I think it's, maybe Representative Hilty knows. I think it's about 15% because the resources, when you're planning a system, you have to count on the wind. If you say you're going to have 800 megawatts of wind, you got to count on that. But the great thing about wind integration is that MISO, our Midwest Independent System Operator, the big regulator that runs our Midwest grid, has figured out how to integrate more and more and more wind and do so in a way that is pretty seamless. And I think that's the great good news story, is that the lights haven't gone out, and wind turbines are able to provide power when they provide power, and other resources are able to fill in the valleys when wind power doesn't produce. And as wind developers, they are, of course, interested in having those turbines rated as high as possible, because that's how they make money, is their electricity production. As regulators have to make sure the lights stay on, and so they have a very conservative capacity factor. But the good news story is that wind is contributing, and it is working in such a way that the lights are staying on, and we're figuring it out.
Okay, so thank you everybody for being a great audience. If you guys have any more questions for the four of us, we'll be around for a little bit longer. Otherwise, the museum is open until 8, so you can feel free to head up there as well. Thank you.